Hey, this is Jen, and welcome to the Dropping Keys podcast. This is a space for honest stories, nervous system wisdom, and body based practices that help women stop pushing, performing, and proving their way through life, and to start creating change from the inside out. I am so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello. Welcome to episode 4 of Dropping Keys. I am your host, Jen Thomas. And a quick disclaimer, I'm recording this out on my back porch this morning. So if you hear birds and wildlife sounds, just know that I'm sitting in the sun right now because it is definitely feeling like the most supported space I can to bring this episode to you today. And I've been wanting to get back on to the podcast and record an episode. But there's been some things going on. So I figured I'd meet myself where I feel most supported today. And it is outside in the sun on my back porch. So here we are together. So the core thread of this episode, this is about what happens when you stop over functioning in a relationship. And the truth finally has room to show itself. Yes, ladies, yes. Are you ready for this? Because I wasn't ready for this. But here we are. And I think it's a great thing to speak about because I know that most women, on some level, are wrapped up in overfunctioning. And we'll talk a bit more about what that means as we get into it. See, for a long time, I thought that most of the emotional distance in my marriage was something that we could work through if I just understood it better and communicated better and softened more around it and explained it more clearly, and I was just more patient, and if my love was more steady, and I did love steadily. No doubt about it. But what I'm seeing now in the ending of my marriage is that I was not only loving, but I was carrying. I was carrying the emotional labor and the translation, and I was carrying all of the repair and meaning making. And I was carrying the bridge between us from both sides. And when I realized this and I started setting boundaries around my own overfunctioning about a year ago, the relationship did not suddenly break. Just there was a gap that became visible. And so, yeah, the core of this episode is my boundaries did not create the gap, they revealed the gap. And that realization has brought a very specific kind of grief. Not just the grief of divorce and losing the relationship and separating, the lives that we've created together, but realizing how long I was actually alone in certain places inside this relationship. And it has touched a much older wound, and that's the wound of wanting to be met and accepted and loved and seen, in the depth of who I am, by someone who simply did not have the capacity to meet me there. And that was true with my mother. And now I can see how that same ache was recreated and lived out in my marriage. So this episode is about overfunctioning, emotional capacity, boundaries, the mother wound, nervous system patterns, grief, and the thread of freedom that begins when we stop trying to be met by people who cannot meet us. Because the grief says they couldn't come with me, but the freedom says, but I still get to go. So I'm recording this inside of something very tender. Not from the other side, not with a perfectly clean resolution, and not with a neat little bow, which is what I see in things on the internet, 1 year post-divorce things, which are super inspirational, don't get me wrong, but they are not where I am right now. I am 2 weeks out from the conversation, deciding on the big D. Um, and I'm recording today, this morning specifically, from the middle of a truth, like really landing in my body. And my marriage ending after 22 years together and almost 20 years married, there's going to be an obvious grief to that. There's a grief of my life changing, and there's a grief of our family structure changing. There's a grief of the memories and the love and the shared history and the future that will not unfold the way I once imagined it. But this episode is about another layer of grief. And this is the grief of seeing the emotional truth of a relationship clearly. Because sometimes the ending of a relationship is not the first time something breaks. Sometimes it's actually the first time we just stop holding it together in a way that keeps us from seeing what was already true. And that's what's been landing for me this morning. I am deeply realizing that a lot of what looked like connection between my husband and I was actually being held up by my overfunctioning, like by my ability to understand and translate, and my ability to feel what was unspoken and to soften around someone else's capacity, and my ability to make meaning out of distance, and my ability, man, to stay persistent in my reaching. Yeah, and when I stopped doing those so automatically, the truth began to get a lot louder. But it wasn't because I created the distance, it was actually because I stopped like covering it up with my overfunctioning. So I've been wanting to record about this current spot in my life and how it translates into the work I do, etc., etc. And I actually recorded an episode a couple days ago, and after I got done with it, I knew that wasn't the episode. And I knew I wanted to record something today. I wasn't quite sure what it was. And I just was doing some work on the computer here, took a break and checked my phone. And there was a small moment that occurred that opened this bigger truth for me. So there's a text exchange between my husband and I that kind of brought this into focus for me. And I want to be careful here because this is not about taking one text message and turning it into some indictment of another person. Nothing is about making him the villain or saying he's a bad person. It's just about the way one small moment can reveal a much larger relational pattern. I had texted him last night in a moment of softness, just saying something about, like, I will always love you. Not romantically or in a grasping way, not in a please come back to me way, not in a way that was trying to undo the divorce at all. It was meant as human love, like as love for someone I've shared so much of my life with, and love for the person, even though I acknowledged the form of our relationship was changing. I just said, I know we're feeling a lot of things, and I just want to say that I love you, and I'll always love you, even as this evolves and changes. I just want you to know that. And his response was that he would always have love for me too. And there's like nothing technically, wrong about it. Wasn't cruel. It wasn't mean. It wasn't obviously dismissive. When I sent the text, the softness, the love towards him, part of me was also acknowledging that he may not respond, and that was okay. I was offering this as just from one loving human being to another going through some really difficult shit, right? But he did respond. But again, it was, I will always have love for you, right? And this landed in my body as distance. Because there's a difference between I love you and I have love for you. One feels very present, and the other feels held at arm's length, right? One feels very relational and open, and the other feels managed and protective. And again, I don't think he's like trying to hurt me or anything of the sort. But I think he was probably just trying to be kind while also keeping the separation very clear. But the effect on my body was grief because it was like, I don't know, it was just up in my face. Like, even here, even now, even when we've decided the relationship culminates as a marriage, we've made that decision together. Like, even when I'm not asking you to be my husband, not asking you to fix anything, not asking you to meet some huge emotional demand, like, even here, when I am just simply naming love, there is a responsive distance. And as I paused for a moment and just sat with that, there was a deeper truth that kind of began to bubble up and became through. I sat down on the couch and I just closed my eyes and I could see this image. And it was like me, kind of like big and feeling, and him distant and small and like rigid. And I want to be clear about what I mean by that. I don't mean small as in small as like a human being. I think the image I was seeing is small in capacity to that particular emotional space, right? Like he was felt contracted and protected and rigid and just unable to come towards me and a kind of emotion into the emotional fullness that I was offering in that moment. And when I saw that image, something in me just like cracked open because I have been kind of creeping in on this truth for a while. I've said pieces of it aloud and I have named the dynamic and I have understood it logically. Like I've known that there was emotional distance. It has been an issue in our entire relationship. I have known there was a mismatch in capacity. And most recently, I've known that I was the one carrying the burden of trying to close that gap. But there is such a difference between knowing something in your mind and having your body finally like let it in. Oh boy, and what landed was that I have been big and feeling and reaching for such a long time. And he has been distant and protected and rigid and unavailable in the places that I most want to be met. You know, and it's not a statement about his worth or his character. It's just about capacity. And to me, emotional capacity matters because someone can love you in the ways that they know how and still not be able to meet you in the depth of who you are. And someone can care about you and still not be able to sit with your feelings. And someone can share a life with you and still not have the willingness or the ability to face their own pain enough to become available for yours. And ladies, that is, I've known it and I've logically wrapped my mind around it and I've spoken about it. But that is a very painful truth to really let all the way in. And this is kind of where I started to realize I'm not only grieving the end of my marriage, but I'm grieving the emotional truth of my marriage. I'm grieving 2 decades of mismatch. I am grieving the places I kept reaching and hoping and waiting. And the part of me that kept thinking, like, maybe if I say it differently, maybe if I soften more, maybe if I explain less, or maybe if I explain more, maybe if I give it time, maybe if I can understand where he's coming from, Maybe if I regulate myself enough, maybe if I don't need as much, like maybe if I can shift in the correct way, then maybe I will finally feel met. And oh my God, that is a very specific kind of grief. Because it's not just loss or recognition. It's like I have been alone in very real places for a very long time. And that kind of grief, it when it first dropped in and I could feel it fully in my body, um, it almost felt unbearable because it rearranges the story from the inside out. It's not just like this relationship is ending, but like, oh, this is actually what this relationship has been. And it's the grief of just seeing my own overfunctioning, seeing what it was able to hide, and how I had convinced myself that that if I just did more, did less, contorted myself, that I could find the key to plug in. I could figure it out. Yeah, because when you're really good at carrying emotional complexity in relationships, you can make a relationship look a lot more mutual than it actually is. You can make the connection look fuller and the emotional intimacy look more alive. And you can dress up the other person's limited capacity so that it looks like enough because you're constantly filling the space around it. And then when you stop, that gap begins to show. uh, and that has been the grief that has been building over the last year when I became aware of this and began to establish boundaries around it. Yeah, but I'm just starting to understand it also as the beginning of freedom. Yeah, so a year ago, I started realizing that what overfunctioning was, I didn't even know what it was. And yeah, I didn't understand how the full depth of what it meant in my life. Like I knew I was tired in my marriage and I knew I was carrying too much and managing too much, and I knew that not only my marriage but a pattern in the wider spectrum of my life. I was very caught up in anticipating everyone else's feelings and needs and responses and their moods and their limits. I began to realize that what overfunctioning really talks to is organizing yourself around what other people can handle, right? And in my marriage, overfunctioning looked like a lot of things that could be mistaken, for love. It looked like being understanding and patient and emotionally mature and the one who could name what was happening, the one who could see and hold both sides. It looked like being the one who could soften and the one who could repair, and that I could translate distance into meaning, and I was the one who could keep the door open, you know? And sure, I mean, some of that was love, but some of it was also a survival pattern. Let's be real. Some of it was also the old pattern rather of trying to create connection by becoming whatever the relationship required me to become. Like less needy, less intense, less emotional, less direct, less disappointed, less impacted, less me. And this is where overfunctioning becomes so tricky because it doesn't always look like self abandonment from the outside. Like sometimes it looks like being responsible and compassionate and wise and, doing the work, quote unquote. But if I'm the only one doing the emotional labor and the relationship only functions when I keep carrying both sides, then something's off. And that's what I began to realize. Like it's not mutual intimacy. It's me like using all of the energy to build both sides of the bridge, right? So when I started setting boundaries around overfunctioning, It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't making some huge declaration. It was just very internal. I started noticing when I wanted to like chase a disconnect moment and when I wanted to explain more than one time. Oh, I was so good at explaining over and over and over and over and over again in different ways, different flavors. Because maybe if I said it this way, it would land and he would connect, right? And I started noticing when I wanted to make like his silence more comfortable for me by filling it. And when I was about to like soften a truth so it'd be easier to hear. And yeah, and I just started practicing not doing those things automatically. Like not coldly and like not in a punishing way, just with more honesty. I just started letting the silence be silent and the distance be distance. And oh, whatever his response was, just be his response. And I started letting myself feel what was true instead of immediately going to repair it or manage it or try to make it mean something that felt less painful. And that's slowly but surely, that's when the gap just became more visible. And, you know, for a while, like it just felt hard and like scary because, like, there's a part of me that would react that would be like, oh, like, did I make this worse? Like, did I create this? Did I pull away? Like, am I loving well enough? Did I ask for too much? Like, a lot of doubt comes up. Um, but then I began to notice and accepting that what I was seeing now that I was just holding a loving boundary for myself to not over effort and over function, it wasn't like me breaking the connection. It actually just revealed how much of the connection depended on me not having the boundary. And like that is very different. My boundaries didn't create the gap, it revealed the gap. And as painful as that was, I also chose to accept it as like clarifying, because if a relationship only works when I am the busy beaver working, 36-hour days on and holding that connection, which is abandoning myself, let's say it plainly, then that relationship's not actually working. It's being held together by my disappearance from me. So this is where the realization, rather, it starts to get a little bit deeper because this was not like just about my marriage. This is touching on to one of the oldest wounds in my lived experience in my body. And that's the wound of wanting to be met and accepted and loved and seen in the depth of who I truly am. And that is by my mother, my primary caretaker. She was a single mom. Um, for all intents and purposes for all of my life, although she did marry and I did have a stepfather. But yeah, that wound of just not receiving that. Um, and again, I want to say this with as much truth and compassion as I possibly can, because my mother just simply did not have the capacity. Um, I don't think she had the willingness or the availability to face her own pain enough to develop that kind of emotional range, right? So we can look at these early relationships and instead of blame, shame, right? It's more of like oh, this is just also their patterning, right? There's no blame or shame in that. It's just what is, right? But as a child, like I can say that as an adult woman, but as a child, you don't understand that patterning or lack of capacity. You just think, or sorry, you don't think, my mom has unresolved trauma and limited emotional development, and therefore I cannot attune to me in the way that I need. You just feel the absence as a kid. You just feel the not being met and not being seen. And you feel the ache inside of you for reaching for someone who just can't meet you fully, who doesn't come all the way towards you, you know? And in the child's body, that often turns into, oh, there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm too much, or I need too much, or I feel too much, or I'm asking for something unreasonable. Like I need to become easier and lower maintenance, and I need to, read this person better, read the room better. I need to become the kind of person like other people can handle. And that's how early adaptation begins. And that's how a child learns to shape herself around someone else's capacity. And then as an adult, that pattern is familiar. We can find ourselves trying to be met by people who cannot meet us. Not because we're dumb, but because our nervous systems will often seek resolution in familiar places. It loves patterns, even when patterns feel like shit. Okay? I say this often, and I will continue to say it often because we need to really ingest and understand this piece, right? It's like some younger part of us is still saying, maybe this time. Maybe this time I can find resolution to this painful pattern, right? Maybe this time, if I just love enough, they'll come towards me. Maybe this time, if I explain clearly enough, they'll understand. If I stay patient enough, they'll finally open. Maybe this time, if I'm just good enough, if I just hit the right notes, they'll finally see me. And the grief that came up this morning in accepting or understanding, holding all of this truth is just the grief of seeing that I cannot make anyone come towards me in a place that they do not have capacity to go themselves. I could not make my mother meet me there, and I could not make my husband meet me there. And that is not because I am unmeetable. And it's an acceptance deep in my heart, in my bones, in my nervous system, that it's not about me. It's because they could not come that far, And this is where nervous system work becomes real, like very real. Because I could understand this pattern long before my body was ready to stop participating in it. I could say, yep, I overfunctioned. Yep, got that mother wound. Yep, I tend to be drawn to relationships where I am trying to be met by emotionally unavailable people. I can understand it and name it and talk about it, but insight and freedom are not the same thing. Seeing the pattern, even if you're lucky enough to see it, is not the same as no longer organizing your life around it. Because the pattern, it lives in your body. The reaching lives in the body. The hope lives in the body, and the bracing and the collapse and the impulse to explain just one more time, that lives in your body. And the impulse to become smaller and it lives in your body. The impulse to make someone else's limitation mean something about your worth, guess what? It lives in your body. So it's not just about saying like, oh, I see this. Oh, I got it. Yep, that's right. That was the pattern. This work is like, can my body begin to feel safe enough to actually stop doing it? Because it's going to send signals cascading to your system that, hey, this is the pattern we know. Again, even if it feels like shit, this is the one we know. And if you stop doing it, we have no other pattern to reference that says, if you do something different, then you'll be loved, right? So your body has to have a sense of safety enough built up in it, reps, that it feels safe enough to stop chasing in this pattern and stop translating and stop softening your truth and stop trying to make the gap disappear. Like safe enough to just let someone else's capacity be what it is. And safe enough to feel this deep grief, without turning it into a verdict on my actual lovability. This is why I speak so often to this work is not mindset work. There's a ton of mindset work out there. But this is not just mindset. Mindset's a piece, right? But it is not the whole picture. And it is not just boundaries as like a concept, right? Not just something you say. A boundary is not just something you say. A boundary is something your body actually has to be able to hold, especially when holding it means you have to finally feel the truth. So much of what we go through in life is situations, rather, repetitive patterns, is us trying to avoid feeling the truth, feeling something we don't want to feel. Yeah. So this morning I'm sitting with the truth of grieving the fantasy. And I don't mean like something like silly or childish. I mean like the deeply human hope that love would eventually be enough to make someone available. The real fantasy that I have held, I didn't recognize it as a fantasy, right? It was a truth to my system and to who I was and to how I interacted in this relationship. That if I loved him well enough and stayed long enough and just understood him deeply enough and communicated clearly enough, if I worked on myself enough and forgave enough and held enough compassion and prayed enough, then eventually the connection would become what I actually needed it to be. And that fantasy, it has a purpose. Our little child minds create these fantasies so that we can keep going on, man, because we can't hold the truth sometimes of something like an emotionally unavailable parent. So the fantasy gets created, and it allows you to keep going and keep trying and stay alive for all intents and purposes, because it helps you stay connected to hope. And it did all those same things in this relationship too. And so when I have to accept and see it as a fantasy and not actually the truth of what I thought was, right? When that fantasy dies, it hurts. It's not just like, oh, I was wrong. Oh. It's like this thing I organized so much of my emotional life around is no longer available. Like there is such grief for me right now in realizing that there's no better version of me that can make someone else emotionally or not better, available, you know? There's no version of me that is the correct version that gives me the level of acceptance and love and connection that I truly want and deserve. There's no softer version or clearer version or more regulated version, no more patient version, more healed version. There's no version of me that can do another person's inner work for them. And that is both devastating to just really let land in my body. And it's also freeing, because then I can begin to accept that if I truly cannot do it for them, then I am free to stop trying. I can stop spending my life force on a task that was just never mine in the first place. So as I sit here with this deep grief, I'm aware there's always two sides to things, at least two sides to things. And so I'm also inviting the truth that this is also where freedom begins. Like not some shiny, I'm fine now kind. Not the like, everything happens for a reason, so let's skip the pain kind. Nah, I like just the quiet, grounded freedom of no longer organizing my life around an illusion. Like once I can really try, or once I can really see, rather, that I've been trying to get water from a dry well, I can grieve the well. And I can honor that well. And I can remember what was beautiful about that well. And I can even love the well. But I can, in those moments, stop standing there with my cup. And that's freedom. And freedom is not that I do not love him, and in that this does not hurt. And it is not that I am not untouched by the grief. Oh boy. No, freedom is that I no longer have to make anyone else's capacity the ceiling for my life. And the grief says, like, he couldn't come with me. But the freedom says, I still get to go. Like, I still get to go deeper. And I still get to be big and feeling. And I still get to tell the truth. And I still get to be met fully. And I still get to build and discover relationships where my depth is not treated like a problem to manage. Damn, dude. And I get to have a life where I don't have to become smaller so someone else can stay comfortable. And I still get to belong somewhere that has room for me and all of me. And like, I don't know, maybe one of the most freeing things is realizing that leaving this pattern doesn't mean that I stop loving. It just means I stop abandoning myself in the name of receiving love. And man, that's a difference, you know? And this can wrap this into, this is one of the deepest pieces of the work I do, because I don't think women are not looking for more, or like out there looking for more information, right? There's endless levels of information and inspiration out there. I believe women are looking for the actual capacity to stop living from patterns that they probably already understand. You probably already know what overfunctioning is and people pleasing, and you probably notice when you shrink, or maybe that, hey, join the club, you chase emotionally unavailable people. I think a lot of women know that they're keep trying to be chosen by people who only know how to love at arm's length. And women know they're tired. But like, knowing does not automatically create the body's sense of safety. And that's why we have to work with the body. Because if your nervous system learned that love requires you to become low maintenance, that's what mine did, then being fully honest and actually trying to evoke change in that space will feel dangerous to your body. It will. It will send off signals of danger. Because if your nervous system was mapped early and it learned that connection requires you to monitor everyone else's emotions, then letting someone else have their own reaction to something, that can feel dangerous. If your nervous system learned that abandonment follows truth, like you speak your truth and you brace for abandonment, then telling the truth is going to feel dangerous to your system. If your nervous system learned that you have to earn love by being like easy to handle, then being like your big, deep, full and feeling self and being direct, guess what? The nervous system's going to tell you, oh, that's dangerous. That's dangerous. We're not going to do that. And that happens before thought. Okay, that's why cognition, like actually having thoughts about understanding and knowing the quote unquote what we're supposed to be changing, it doesn't work, ladies, because all of those things I just described Those are autonomic nervous system responses. They are mapped early, pre 7 years old, and they will fire nanoseconds before you have a cognitive thought. So you can have all the information in your lap, but if you do not work with the body itself and the nervous system itself and the sensations themselves rather, the thought will not fire. It'll be an afterthought. What your nervous system knows to be safe or unsafe is what is going to run automatically. Okay? The work is not to shame the pattern, right? The work is to first understand why it made sense to your body. The work is to create enough internal safety that you can actually begin to choose differently. There's space to choose differently. Not perform differently, not force yourself into some like temporarily empowered version of yourself. Sorry, I'm just going to call it what it is. But actually become able to stay with yourself when the old pattern fires and wants to take over. That's where the body comes in. That's where we notice when we're reaching, or we notice how we're bracing. We notice that we want to collapse. And we notice the body is where we notice the impulse to explain or soften or fix or manage or disappear, right? But the body is also where we begin to practice something new. It's where we practice staying in those sensations and breathing and feeling them, and where we practice safety that allows truth to be true and the gap to be visible, and where we can let someone else's limited capacity exist without making it mean that we are too much. Because it's not about becoming like detached or cold. No, it's the opposite. It's not about never needing anything from anyone. It's about being able to stay with yourself when someone else cannot meet you. And that is a totally different type of freedom. Yeah. So what does this change? It changes the question. For so long, the question underneath the pattern was, how do I become easier to love? Like, how do I say it so he understands, or so he doesn't become defensive? How do I soften this so it lands? And at times it was, how do I need less? How do I make this relationship feel connected enough? And how do I get someone who cannot meet me to finally meet me? I really thought that one day I would have some perfect equation and I would crack the code. Now the question kind of shifts. It becomes something else. It becomes like, where do I belong when I stop auditioning for love? Where does my life go? Where does it want to go when I stop making someone else's limits the edge of my world? Boom. Mic drop. Right? Who am I when I am no longer building the bridge? Like using that level of energy to build bridges from both sides. What kind of love becomes possible? Oh, when I'm just not trying to earn it through some form of self-abandonment. These are all the doorways. But in order to walk through them, I have to walk through them with the grief intact, but I am walking through them. And that matters because grief is not the opposite of freedom. Oh boy, no, grief is what we pass through when we are finally telling the truth. And grief sometimes is the sound of the old pattern, like finally losing its grip on our lives and our perception and our reality. Sometimes grief is just the part of us that has waited so long to finally be realized and assured that we're not going to leave her there anymore. Damn, dude. Sometimes I say things and I'm just like, whew, I might have to go back and listen to this myself. Ugh. We're along for the ride together, ladies. I'm in the driver's seat, but we're We're definitely on this journey together. All right, so maybe this isn't about divorce for you. Like maybe this hits you and it feels closer to to relationship, like in friendship. Maybe it's out your mother, your father, or your siblings. Maybe it's in your business partner or your business itself or your, vocation that you choose. Maybe it's just some version of love that you can identify that you've been trying to earn for a very long time, right? And so I just want to offer you a question, maybe a few. I'll probably give you a few. Like, where might you be using your emotional capacity to cover for someone else's lack of it? Where in your life are you building the bridge from both sides, right? Where are you making a connection maybe look fuller than it actually is? Um, where in your life are you practicing, or are you calling it rather patience, when it actually might be more like self abandonment? And yeah, is there a place in your life that you're calling it loyalty when you're actually just staying someplace that you're underfed, right? And again, this is not about shame or blame. These patterns come from a very intelligent response within our bodies, right? They were intelligent at a place and we needed protection and we needed connection. And these patterns help us survive as kids. But at some point, we do get to ask whether the thing that once helped us survive is now keeping us from actually being fully alive. And that is a holy question. Not an easy one, but a holy one. It really is. So yeah, the key I want to drop today is this. That sometimes your boundaries do not create the loss. Sometimes they reveal the loss that was already there. And yeah, that revelation can feel devastating. It really can. Because when you stop over functioning, you may finally see how much of the relationship actually depended on you abandoning yourself. You may finally see the gap, and you may finally have to feel the grief. And you may also feel the very first thread of freedom. Yeah, because once you stop carrying both sides, I'm only speaking from 2 weeks in. Now, I guess a year. In a year, I've been practicing this not carrying both sides. And it's been very difficult. Far more difficult staying in the relationship than the past 2 weeks as we've had some more separation. But I'm telling you, like your energy, you start to be understanding how much energy you spend doing it. And your energy starts coming back to you. And yeah, your truth like starts coming back to you and your body starts celebrating a little bit. Like it starts coming back on, like, and it's like a glimpse of what your future may hold with this energy that is starting to return to you. It starts to become the gas tank, if you will, of possibility is starting to fill back up because that energy that you've been expending outward starts to fill it back up. You start to begin to understand I can love someone and stop making their capacity the ceiling for my life. And I can grieve what they could not give me and still stop trying to extract it from them. I can honor what was real about this relationship and still tell the truth about what was always missing. And I can be big and feeling and fully myself and still be safe in the world. And I can stop auditioning for love and acceptance in places that require me to abandon parts of myself. Again, the grief says, you know, it couldn't come with me. The situation can't come with me. But the freedom says, and yet I'm still safe to go. So maybe it's not just the ending of a relationship. Maybe it's the ending of the pattern where love required me to leave myself, where acceptance required me to leave myself. And I gotta say that maybe that's where this next life begins. Until next time, ladies, I love you. I'll talk to you soon.